Today on the podcast, I have Tim Butler. Tim is the managing partner and founder of GrowthFire. They're an investment group. And I got in contact with Tim a couple of months ago, and right off the bat, it was super clear that he was an operator. He was a guy who actually had grown companies, had been in the trenches, understood hiring, understood accountability. And this whole conversation is really about how do you build a performance culture in companies. And I think all from a startup standpoint, everybody wants a performance-based culture, but it's super hard. So we go through a lot of the core elements. How do you think about hiring? How do you think about product market fit? How do you think about go-to-market? And how do you think about culture? Those are the four areas that we really focus on in this conversation. I think there's a lot of lessons learned. There's a lot of frameworks in it. And I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. Tim, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you making this time.
Oh man, it's so good to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Well, good. Well, you and I talked a couple months ago, and what struck me about our conversation was just maybe the operational depth that you have, right? You've basically been in large corporations, you've been in some smaller corporations, you've helped some turnaround, you've helped companies that maybe spun out something and started something. And so like in a theme, I guess, from a lot of this, and in partly our conversation was, you got paid to like execute, right? That's basically what we all get paid to go do, right? Like there's an objective and there's a goal, and then whether you're in sales or you're in finance or whatever you're happening to be, you basically have to figure out how to execute and deliver on those objectives. And so that's what kind of got me excited about this conversation. And so maybe why don't we start with maybe just a little bit of background about how did you get to the point you're at, and maybe some of the kind of key stops along the way.
Oh man, okay. So real quick, how I got to where I was going to be an architect at one point, and decided I didn't. Didn't decide. It was decided for me that I didn't have the freehand skills, and I found that architects were a dying breed. So I wanted to build something because that's in my blood. So I decided I was going to build companies. If I couldn't build buildings, I was going to build companies. So my career has really been geared around kind of that overarching element. Background in finance. I've got a background in technology. I was an accidental technologist. That's how I got into the technology arena. But it's all been around trying to understand how the different parts of businesses come together in order to create value for the customers, value for the business, and then ultimately how that value is shared. So my entire career is around that. I've deliberately played a role in just about every part of an organization, technology organization can. Spent about a dozen years developing systems. I've built go-to-market organizations. A lot of my career has been around the go-to-market side, sales, marketing, et cetera, product management. And then I've run 5 companies, including startup that was sold successfully, including a startup that was not sold successfully. So there's great experience on both sides of that. I've learned way more from the failures than I ever have from the wins. I've also raised a private equity fund, and I've helped companies doing the funding side as well. How you put all the different pieces together. So that, my background's been very deliberate around how do you build companies, and what is it that makes these companies run well? What is it that accelerates companies? And I think that's a lot about what our discussion is today.
Yeah, maybe is there like a theme? It sounds like you are pretty deliberate on getting some of these different experiences kind of around the different business domains. Did you find that over time you basically built a toolkit of things that basically you kind of knew, and then there was things that were on the edges that you had to learn? Like I'm always curious about this because I do think that, at least if I look at my own career, a lot of it is about people, right? And so you basically are trying to figure out, kind of what goals and objectives and how you define success, and then you're looking at the process and you're evaluating the people. But I'm kind of curious from your perspective, did you end up having kind of almost a playbook of saying every place I go, there's some element I got to learn, but there's a core set of how I go and execute and deliver on things?
So if we talk about technology specifically, software or software tech, software and hardware technology companies and services companies related to that, but the ones that fit into software, it's going to be different if you're a little bit different if you're a manufacturing company.
Sure.
I think because the market dynamics tend to be a little bit different if you are a metal bender or a job shop that's producing parts for some. how the market works, what you look for, how you do that is different. The interesting thing about software companies is, roughly 2/3 of the expense structure in a software company and growing is your people.
Is people.
So there are three things. There are three things that I think make a difference between the most successful companies and those that either end up in the middle or don't make it at all. The number one thing is your human capital.
Okay.
It's fascinating to me, and we've had this conversation where human capital doesn't show up on the balance sheet, but it's your greatest asset. No question about it. If you get the right people, your company is going to do extremely well. Now, you could have some great people, and you don't have the right culture, and you're going to get poor results. But if you've got the right people in the organization, the right culture, the right leadership, the right vision, the purpose, the why, and what you're after, chances are, or not the chances, but the probabilities are strongly in your favor. So it's product market fit. Are you solving the right problem for a given market that they're willing to pay for? Do you have the right people in the organization at all levels? And there's a whole model in there that I hope we can talk about around what does that mean? How do you find them? What's the philosophy around the compensation structure, the management approach? How do you engage and keep those people in the organization, because they're the ones that are going to make the difference? And then ultimately, the third thing is your go-to-market model. What's the approach for how you go to market to share the value you have and capture the value from the market that's available.
So is that a good framework for this conversation? I mean, I feel like that it touches on a lot of different elements of it.
It does.
Yeah. And so, I mean,
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're probably not going to get to it all in a 45, 50-minute conversation, but maybe that's a right framework to start with. So why don't you start with just the human capital side? And that starts with hiring and finding people. And understanding kind of upside in it. I know that you're a big proponent of the book Who and kind of a hiring kind of philosophy around that. So maybe we start there.
Yeah. So at a high level, I find it fascinating that some of the biggest things and some of the biggest determinants of success in life aren't taught in schools anywhere. I have yet to see a program that's a formal, here's how you interview to get the information that you need. And interviews are artificial constructs, right? They're trying to sell their best. You're trying to uncover the worst. Yeah, and in the middle, you're both trying to figure out whether there's a fit, and it's just a convoluted process. So, my experience, I've looked at this for the longest time because I'm a huge believer in human potential, and I believe that the direction that the markets are going, this notion of human potential and culture in organizations is going to be the determinant of success over the next decades to come. I think that's where we are with this, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But going back to, oh my goodness sakes, it's at least 15, 16, 17 years now. I had the good fortune to be working with a group out of San Francisco, a private equity group called Alpine Investors. And, Alpine was recognizing that in order to get the kind of returns that they needed to get out of their funds, they needed to do something different. So they looked and they started doing the research, and we started developing this model around how do you identify? I guess first, how do you attract? How do you identify? How do you interview? How do you onboard? And how do you manage the people that you really want to have in your organization, right? And those are, everybody talks about the vaunted A player. Well, so first, let's start with a definition of what an A player is, right? And an A player is that person that's 90% likely to do what 10% of the competitors can't, right? And that's the person that is going to walk through walls for whatever the job description is. and I'll use job description. I'm going to change that. So there was a guy by the name of Jeff Smart, came out of Stanford, spent a lot of time researching what worked and what didn't work. And he developed a model called the Who model, that you referred to, that's around how do you go through interviewing these people. And one of the really interesting things about that model was the work that it directed back at the executives in the company. As an example, in order to start the search for somebody, you have to create a scorecard. And a scorecard is made up of three things. It's made up, first thing is a one-sentence vision of what the person in that role should focus on. And if you've got the right people in your organization, all they need is that one sentence to say, here's my vision, I'm going to go get it, no matter what. That excites an A-level, that kind of description of an A-level candidate. The person that's not the A-level candidate is going to say, well, I'm going to need a lot more information than that. I'm going to need, tell me what I need to do on Monday. Tell me what I need to do on Tuesday. When do you need this report? The A player is saying, no, I got it. That's my job.
Let me go.
Take that hill, right?
Yeah.
But the scorecard does a couple of really interesting things, because the second section of scorecard is obviously the core competencies that you have to have for the world, and experiences. And then the third is, what are the success criteria for the next 6-12 months? Now, what's really interesting is that it's rare that a manager sits down ahead and says, what are the things that I need this person to accomplish over the next 12 months that are then agreed between us and are reviewed regularly, and that's what our focus is going to be. And if it changes, there's a negotiation in a process that changes. Now, what's fascinating about that is that if I'm coming into an organization as a CEO or as a VP or in any level, and the person sitting across from me says, here's the 12 things that we agree that we need to succeed at over the course of the next X period of time, is like, awesome, that's what we're going to do. Now, if you change that, then we need to sit down and have a conversation about it. But the very dynamic that is set in place forces business planning to take place. Now, I love that approach because it sets the stage for the discussions of the year. If I'm the CEO leading the organization, I say, how are you doing against those? What do you need? How can I help you with that? And it's a completely different execution dynamic around that. The person feels enabled, they feel supported, they feel as though they're on a mission, they're going to accomplish this. And the right kind of people are excited about that. The other thing that scorecard does, and I'm going to jump ahead here a bit, but the other thing the scorecard does is it allows you to look at the business and say, what do we need the business to accomplish over the course of the next year that might have been different than the last year? And you get a chance to recreate that scorecard. Now, I don't think you can do that in an IBM level organization where you've got 300,000 people, sure, and you're going to be doing, maybe 200,000 scorecards. That's an incredibly difficult task. But if you're an organization of fewer than 100 people or 100 to 150 people, and you're scaling up, what the business needs changes. Mm-hmm. And there's an agreement when executives sit down with the people that they're working with and say, here's how we're going to structure this next year so that we can achieve the things we need to do this next year that are different than the last year. And the WHO model gives you the tools and enable that, which is just a phenomenal model. So from the recruiting to the interviewing, how do you go about the interview process is a very structured process. It's very different. It's almost like the classic STAR process, situation, tactic, action, result. There's some elements to it that are very similar to that, but it's really more focused on how do you pull out the highlights of how somebody achieved what they achieved versus just what they achieved, because there's a lot of difference. I've seen a lot of people in my career that were fortunate enough to ride a wave versus grab the shovel. And I want to make sure I'm in an industry where there's a wave, right? But I want people grabbing shovels instead of surfboards, right?
So let me talk a couple of pieces in this, because I feel like Concur did a lot of the right things here. We didn't use the WHO model. I think we did do a lot of the kind of one sentence type stuff, and I think we wanted people that. We hired a lot of generalists. We hired a lot of folks that maybe didn't have specific domain expertise. I started off in engineering, which I was maybe qualified for, but then I did 14 other jobs that I wasn't qualified for, right? And so, but what they were basically saying was, we trust you to go figure this out, and you have a set of skills. And so they hired a lot of generalists that had ambition, had drive. And then one of the things that I think that maybe you haven't touched on is we were okay with change. Right? We're going to keep pivoting. We're going to keep things are going to change in your world. And you did talk a little bit about this, but I think like a lot of startups that are going through kind of that high growth, you gotta be comfortable with change, and that like the company is going to take care of you if something doesn't exactly work out, or I worked on projects that didn't work out at all. Right. And so that was a bet that we made, It didn't work
Yeah.
out. And so, okay, fine. We're going to put you on this next one.
So let's talk about that for a second, because at the heart, if you peel that back, at the heart of the ability to change in an organization is trust.
Yep, that's true.
Right. You have to create a culture of trust. So one of the elements that that's been a part of every organization that I've been in, either it was there or I worked really hard to bring it in, was this notion of I encourage failure. And I think you have to. I think you have to do that if you're going to succeed. I encourage failure.
Yeah.
Let's not do it 2 or 3 times the same way. You know, prefer that. But
Exactly.
but right. But I absolutely encourage failure. And the interesting thing is, if you encourage failure and say, look, I do not expect you to be perfect. I want you to try things, because we can't win if we don't do something different. All right, so let's go ahead and do something different. Now, there are a lot of things you need to do in a business to make sure everyone is in communication with. If your sales team is going to go do something fundamentally different, you want to know about it, because
Sure.
your finance guys might need to plan for it. There might be some new expenses, right? You might have a dip in performance. If your development team is gonna do something different, maybe they're going to take on a different approach, and it's going to delay the next release, but it's going to accelerate the following release. You got to have good communication around that, but that's all part of the same trust equation. But I think if you encourage trust and you support trust and encourage the failure aspect of that, then ultimately that drives accountability, because people are okay standing up then and saying, I failed at that, and that's okay. It's like, celebrate it.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah.
We found something that didn't work.
What did
in
we
this set.
learn, and what are we going to apply to it?
What are we
forward?
going to apply to it? Right. So I think failure becomes a big part of it. So you were saying, we had some projects that just didn't fail, but you felt safe. You felt your manager had your back. So you talked a little bit about this notion of hiring generalists, and I think I have this sense that there was actually something more that they were looking for than saying, I'm going to go out and hire a generalist, right? So there are, when I look at hiring teams, I'm looking at hiring passion. I'm looking at hiring curiosity. I'm looking at hiring motivational elements, and there are a number of things that you can take a look at, and you say, well, this is a generalist, but if you and I'm going to go back to linking it to the scorecard for a moment. But if you do a really good job of building out the scorecard and saying what you really need in it, rather than saying, I'm just looking for somebody who's done this job before, you get some really interesting dynamics. So I needed to hire a COO in a technology company that had a lot of logistical elements to it, from the product delivery to the implementation to the support. And I wanted somebody that had the ability to really break down problems, because it was an unnecessarily complex system. So I looked at what the requirements were, and there was a gentleman I recruited over who was actually the director of flight operations for one of the major airlines. Now, what was interesting was that person spent all day long solving problems as they came up, but he had a heavy process orientation. He wanted to solve it, but didn't want to just keep solving. He wanted to solve it once and then fix it. So he had a great profile. Now, who would ever think about hiring somebody from the airlines to run operations and support and the install? This guy, right? Right. And now some would say he was a generalist, but what I knew about him was he had the ability to do a couple of things. He was incredibly connected to his people. Right, so he could develop the trust in his team. He had great problem-solving skills, and he had a process orientation. And it's like, that's
check,
the guy.
Check.
Yeah, that's the guy, right? And I think there are a lot of people that would look at hiring that COO and say, I need somebody who's been a COO in a software company before.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of reasons people end up in different roles. And so I think it breaks down to what the fundamental skills are. And I would guess, if I were to have the chance to look back at some of the people in Concur, I think they probably had all the same kind of elements. They could, they had the ability to create trust. They had the ability to create teams of people. They had the ability to solve, interesting problems and the environment where they felt safe doing it.
So there's like a tangent on that one that's kind of interesting to me that I think that there's a parallel that I would say is I like hiring younger people in general that maybe have some of that high potential. They have a lot of the things you're talking about depending on the job, but they don't have all the legacy thinking of a bunch of other jobs in that sphere. And so this one was kind of a good example where he was in airline logistics and she basically brought him over. So he had the process engineering pieces of it, but he never run a technology company. So there's a piece of newness to that to him where he's got like a comfort level of like, this is just another process. But there's also an opportunity to ingrain him in a way that you want to think about building that business on top of those core assets. Whereas, this happens with salespeople all the time, right? They work in something, they're a black box. They don't want to adhere to your transparency, who's going to do the prospecting. Like there's a whole bunch of things. But if they grew up in kind of a sales process that was transparent, that was the way that B2B sales is done, they're going to be great. But it's like there's a combination of newness and repetitiveness that you have to kind of balance in that. And I think you articulated with this one gentleman, and we saw this quite a bit at Concur. And I don't know if that resonates with you at all.
Yeah, it does. So let me go. Let me touch directly on that. So we had an opportunity where we were building a sales organization. This is actually when we were back at Epicor, and I came in when it was about a $4 million job shop software package, and was part of the team that built it up to the $350 million organization that finally went public. And one of the things that we did there was we had 6 criteria that we were looking for specifically for people that we were going to hire into the sales team. And we had to take a hard look at it and say, okay, do we go out and we spend the money to hire the guy who's been doing this for the last 20 years? And we thought, no, we're not going to do that, because ultimately we wanted the ability to create something different. The go-to-market model was changing in software was changing at that time, and we wanted the ability to be flexible and change through that without bringing in all of the old stuff that we would necessarily have to untrain. Yep. So, we had 6 criteria, and they were, we spent a lot of time on this, but I'll just step through them. Intelligence, motivation, coachability. Then there was communication skills, fit with the group, and what I call representative persona. In other words, how well were they going to represent you when they were outside the walls in front of people? And here's where that takes it. If you're going to do that, you have to have a development process in your organization to train, to manage, to develop, to coach, to mentor. And that's a really interesting stage to be at. At that point, we're at 4, going to 20, going to 40, on the way up to 350, right? But what you do as a management team is very different, and what you look for as a management team is very different. So I started looking for managers in the organizations that have this sense of passion, curiosity, but they have to have the ability to develop and coach. Not all managers or leaders have the ability to develop and coach. And if you're a subscale organization looking to achieve scale, and you're going to bring in the talent like we're describing, the younger talent you should shape and mold, you have to have the development model in place in order to do that. So you've got to give thought to what are my values? What are the things I'm going to look for? What are the criteria I'm going to look for? How am I going to train them up? And your role then changes from working in the business, what they say, working in the business, to working on the business. Yeah. That gives you the ability to scale up, because you've got to put the processes in place to say, here's what I'm going to train you on. Here's how the process unfolds. Here are the skills that are necessary for doing that. So I think I completely agree with you on this notion of I have a preference for bringing in people in the organization that have, they're incredibly motivated, they're sharp people, they're really curious. They want to do well. They may not have the skills, and I want to develop them and create those skills and help them succeed as individuals. And when they do, the business is going to thrive. The key is you have to be able to put that model in place, or find people outside the organization that can come in and help you put that model in place. Because without the model, you can't do it.
You can't scale it.
Yeah.
One element that you didn't really talk about that I guess I always look for is just self-awareness, right? I think this kind of goes back to
Oh,
coachability. I mean, it's embedded in a lot of things, but like you
yeah.
see a lot of talented people that can't see their blind spots, and then they top out pretty quickly. And so I don't know if that's like your experience as well, but I think that self-awareness is a pretty big one because I think then they become way more malleable as far as like helping them grow, understand, and then it gives you a better sense as a manager. What can I do to give you more rope in your strengths? And then how do I help you either develop or manage some of the areas that maybe you have deficits, depending on, but you have to be self-aware to have that conversation, acknowledge where you're at. And I think that's a key piece to like building your career.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. Yeah, I don't think you can. I think it's difficult to have strong curiosity or strong coachability if you
Without it.
don't have the self awareness, right? If you're a 20 something and you're still working on that, I mean, I think you can. I think you can see the people that are eventually going to develop it,
Yep.
and,
Yep.
and that goes back. That goes back to what I envision are some of the traits that you brought as well, which is you take them under your wing and you coach and you develop them and you mentor them
Yep.
and they develop that.
Sure.
But
Well,
if they're not
with
in the right
trust.
organization, if they're in a command and control structure, if they're in the
Yeah.
top down approach, I think it quashes that development of that self awareness. And again, that goes back to human capital. And the more you can bring that out, the more you can develop the human capital in the business, the more you get back out of it. That sounds very capitalistic, but it's really, I mean, it's actually much more humanitarian than you're helping people achieve their potential.
Yeah, that's just exactly where I was going to go. I did, like the growth that we had at Concur, if we didn't basically hire from within, right? We hired a lot of people. We basically
Yeah.
hired for talent and potential, and then we basically promoted from within. Like that was critical. And I think it goes directly to what you're saying is how do we give you the best opportunity to maximize whatever talent you have? Right. And so I don't care if that's a manager, director, VP, maybe your chief product officer, right? It doesn't matter. Like we just want to figure out like where you fit. We want to have as much headroom as we possibly can. And then we're in a company that can give you that if you want to execute and grow with us.
And it did. Concur grew rapidly. It was extraordinarily successful. I think it's interesting because I think it was far more successful as a high growth organization than it has been inside the container,
SAP.
of an entirely different culture, not
Yeah.
only internationally but from a company standpoint.
I would agree with you, Tim. I would agree with you. As people that my brother's still there, I've still a couple of friends there, just beating their head against the wall. So yes, they would agree with you too.
Well, right now, and this whole conversation is ultimately about value and people and culture and those elements. If you're beating your head against the wall, are you really giving your all?
Yep.
Nah.
Are you collecting a paycheck?
That's right. That's right. That's right.
It becomes
Yeah.
a much more transactional. I do work and you give me a paycheck. That's it. Right. And so
Yeah.
again, I'm not like criticizing people that want to do that. But it's not the ingredients to a high growth opportunity. There's just no question about it.
No,
Yeah.
not at all.
Yeah.
It's entirely different culture. It's
It is.
a much more stable organization.
Yeah.
It is. I think the people that we're talking about here, yourself and myself, I'm going to project there, but I have this sense that it's about creating something more. It's about purpose, and it's about winning in a big way that's very different.
Yep. I agree. Okay, well, we're 27 minutes in and we've got to the first topic. So that's pretty good. I mean, it's a great topic. It's good. But maybe we have to pivot a little bit to keep it
Okay.
moving. So
Okay.
product market fit, I think, was your second one.
Oh, product market fit. It's really interesting because what I've seen in a lot of what I call the emerging stage companies that are stuck. Right. There was a great body of work that was done by. Oh my goodness sakes! I'm trying to remember the name. It was called "Too Big to Be Small, Too Small to Be Big," and it was done by a consulting group out of Atlanta. And they identified 5 reasons why companies get stuck, and they fail to get unstuck. And the very first reason on there was market, right? And it more often than not, what I will see is a company that is founded around the product concept, And there's this notion of if you build it, they will come. I call it the Kevin Costner problem, right?
Yeah.
I see it a ton. If you build it, they will come. It's a cool product. It's a neat product, and maybe the company did really well for a couple of years. And when I take a look at the industry dynamics, what I'll oftentimes find is that there was a emerging industry sector where there was, and this goes back to the chasm model, right? And that the early adopter segment of the market is about 7% of the market. So that can give a lot of false sense of, that early success can give a lot of false sense in there. And they find out, it's like, great, I got there. Now the rest of the market isn't buying. Yeah. Right. Whether they're in the chasm or whether the market there isn't just that much market for it. So there are a number of models that are out there that allow for the testing. What I find really interesting is that if you look at consumer product companies as an analog, there's no consumer product company that wouldn't extensively test the product concept in the marketplace before they ever released it. But we do that all the time in technology. We build it and we say, I can build it even faster now than I used to build it before. I think that's one of the challenges that we have coming up with AI, is that we're going to have the ability to build something faster than we ever have.
But should you?
But should you? And will somebody pay you for that?
Right.
And unless there's traction and customers are saying, I got this is a must-have product for me. It's really hard to scale the company to that next level. So product market fit. It's interesting because there's so many elements that have come from other industry sectors. Six Sigma came into healthcare from GE, and you can't operate healthcare today without Six Sigma. Pick a topic, and it's striking to me that this whole notion of the consumer product goods model and how they test hasn't made its way into technology in a more consistent and persistent way.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And I think that this is actually, I think you talk about the AI shift. I think this is even maybe more pronounced, and it's even slower, I think, than it's happening on this like design shift, right? So I think about Salesforce, and I think about a lot of legacy companies that are basically taking AI components and agents and embedding them in their legacy workflows. And my personal opinion is you're kind of putting lipstick on a pig, right? It's like what you really need to do is rethink the whole process of getting stuff into a CRM, right? And so if I could use my Otter or my Read EAI to basically pull all that information, pull the information and put it into the CRM proactively, and really rethink the whole workflow from a first principle standpoint because of the tools that I have today. I think that when you look at product managers, a lot of us are still thinking about it in kind of legacy thinking. And I think what's going to happen if you really want to change and get to product market fit, there's a whole paradigm shift to thinking about how do you build products in this new AI world that isn't just bolting on or just leveraging, but really thinking about like, what is the workflow that I have to go through for this process and how should it actually work? And
I think you're right. Yeah.
And I think like we're starting to see some of this with our entrepreneurs in our program, but we're having to challenge them a lot of times saying, that's just because it's a form, going through it isn't necessarily the easiest way to go do it. Is there a better way to go do it with the new tools that we have? And so I do really agree with you. I think that product market fit is important. I just think it's becoming more and more important as this whole market changes.
I agree. It's interesting because I'm curious to see how the market handles that. Because if you look at consumer packaged goods companies again, the people running those organizations tend to be marketing. They come from a marketing background. The people that come from the people that are developing product today on the technology side tend to come from a technology background, from an engineering background of some kind. So there's this sort of this notion of what background do you come from that drives that. Now, given that you can develop a product so much faster, there's a question of, will they take the time to say, man, I can develop it fast. What do I need? Is it going to be marketplace iterations are going to come faster that will drive that, which is kind of coming at it from the backside? Or will it be the ability to step back and say, let's really take a look at what they need. So even though I can build it really quickly, I want to make sure that I'm developing something that they're looking for.
I think there's two things. I think so. I'm 100% with you. This is like preaching to the choir on this one.
It
So
is.
it really is.
Two of us here. Yeah, we'll solve
Yeah.
this.
So I think that like in our program, we basically make you do a whole bunch of customer discovery. And if you can't get more than 50% of those people to actually sign a beta agreement that they'll actually do it before you write a lick of code, you do not have value, right, at all. And what we're really looking for is, are there a handful of those customers that will prepay you for the product because it's so compelling that before you build anything, they're actually already signed contracts. And so you don't have, like, I bet you like 3 to 5% of our companies that go through actually get that. But like as a minimum bar, if you interviewed 30 companies and you can't get 15 of them to sign up on the beta agreement, you do not move on to dev for the exact reason.
I'm a huge fan of the idea of the customer funded development model, which you just described. Right? It used to be the way it was done.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Now we just give VC money, right?
No. Right.
Kinda.
That's true.
Kinda. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. We get started with friends and family, and then we get into the VC side, and we get up. And nobody, rarely does anybody really win on that, but the investors on that. That's a different. But yeah, the customer funded development model is an incredibly powerful model. It's interesting because I wonder if the availability of money is thwarting that. There's too much. There's too much capital that's sitting in the overhang right now.
Yep.
That needs to find a place to go. That makes it really easy to take the capital to build it, but it's the wrong way to do it.
Totally agree with you. And I think for us, we're trying to build niche little companies that maybe aren't attracting the capital. So we want to build a sustainable business to start with, right? Like you've got something in a vertical that makes sense. Go validate it. Go get those guys to commit to it, whether it's dollars or if it's just usage, and then basically build. And I think it's a better way to build sustainable business, even if you want to raise capital. You need a sustainable business with a value proposition that you've understood and well researched.
No question. No question. You'll preserve your own capital, your own equity, right? It'll be much more effective investment. Everybody will be happier at the outset. Yeah.
It's just hard, right? I think going back to your comment, in CPG companies, it's marketing people that go do this. That's super comfortable. That's their job. And you either have product people or you have technology people that think they know the industry, and they don't always like talking to people and hearing things like "my baby's ugly" or "you have to iterate" or like "there's something better to go do."
Interesting.
It's a skill though too, right? Like doing that customer discovery is a skill, right? Like the whole question about if you ask Henry Ford, like they want faster horses, not new cars. And so translating where the market's going, what people are seeing, and realizing where your vision can be a complex process.
Yeah, it's interesting because marketing people tend not to care what the product looks like initially. They don't care what the product is. They care what the need is, and they care what the customer's looking for in a solution.
That's a really good point, actually, Tim.
Yeah. Technology people care what the product looks like.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So they try to find the market. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what you're really trying to do is say, we have to agree on the problem that we're trying to go solve, right? And so the how, it doesn't really matter. It's like, can we actually solve the problem that you really have, that you're willing to pay money and change your behavior? And that's not always easy.
No, it's not. It's not.
Yeah.
No.
Well, good. Let's talk about the third one, because I think the third one is kind of near and dear to my heart, go to market. And I think maybe I'll just open this up with kind of Concur's experience. We spent a lot of money on sales and marketing. And I don't know exactly where it is, but I would guess it was north of 40% of revenue. And I would say that we are a sales-led company. I think that we really did lead with thought leadership, where we're basically saying we think we know where the market is going, and we're going to cast a vision about where that is in the market. And if we're right and we execute on it, then the market will catch up. And as a result, we charged Cadillac prices, and we may not have had always the best product in the marketplace at the time. And so it really did become a moat. And so for me, it was a front row seat to seeing like how you could do that and the value of a strong go-to-market strategy. And so I'm sure you've had similar experiences, but for me, that was a big part of our growth. And in combination with that thought leadership, right? You're not building the product of today, you're building the product of today and tomorrow and kind of where we're going. And people wanted to partner with you because they felt like you're going to provide the solution that I need for my needs today. But like as the market evolves 5-10 years from now, you're the guy who's thinking about that problem and not me.
Yeah, so let's take that apart. So a couple of things. You described earlier you were the Cadillac product with a Cadillac price without maybe the best product in the market. But at the time Concur came out, the alternative was spreadsheets. It took a lot of time, and right. I mean, it was a lot
it was
of
thrown in
spreadsheets.
from an ERP, right? There was an ERP solution that was terrible too. Yep.
Yeah, it was terrible. So what's really interesting about that, and that goes back to our product market fit conversation, is that there was a big problem that was unsolved.
Yep.
Now, I'm not a big believer in it's the best product that wins. Yeah. I'm a believer in it's the vision, it's the execution, it's the go to market, it's delivery. All of those elements. It's not about the best product. If it was, Microsoft money would have won out over Quicken. Right.
That's a good point.
Or Beta. Beta would have won over VHS. Pick a product. It's not the best product. It's the best execution in the marketplace. And I think that the messaging and the vision and the focus on the singular focus on the product had a huge impact. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, so the second thing around the messaging and the vision casting, I think there's a really interesting transformation taking now. I've been spending a lot of time taking a look at this ABM model or where it's been and where it's going. And account-based marketing, I think in the world of AI that we have now, with the tools that we have now, provide for and allow for a lot of deep granularity in terms of how we communicate with people, in terms of what our message is and how we build that relationship with them around solving the problems that they're trying to solve. So I think there's a sea change coming around go-to-market, where in order to drive the same volumes, the 40% of overall expense levels you were talking about, mm-hmm. I think we're going to see that decline.
Yeah,
and I think that the AI, particularly generative AI, and the content it can produce, and some of the deep learning networks that they have for figuring out what message will resonate with who at what time will become important. And I think that's going to support what I believe is the buying processes of the customer more than we've used them to support the selling processes of the companies. And I'm a huge believer of aligning to the buying cycle of the customer or the client. Yeah. Versus trying to quote unquote sell them something. Never been comfortable. I've been in sales, or sales relay capacity for 2 decades, and my perspective, I don't want to sell somebody something they don't want. I want to help them make the best decision they can. And I think some of the tools that we have available are going to change that. And I think that if that had been available at the time, Concur is the kind of organization that would have taken advantage of it and executed on it well. Yep. And instead of 40%, going into sales and marketing, it could have been 30 or maybe even south of that.
So let's dig into this, because I guess, like, personally, I'm doing a bunch of work on this, even just for Wildfire, right? Where we don't have a ton of leads when we're thinking about selling franchises, right? So let's say I'm looking at the 10-state region, and I think, okay, the first overlay for me was, let's write a 1-pager on what's going on in the state from an economic standpoint, like macro. And so there's a bunch of that. Then you basically bring it down to the region. They're an EDO, they're an economic development officer in like a region. And so figure out what that is. What's their background? And how is that different than maybe the VP of research that may buy from us too? So maybe what you're getting to, or what I'm maybe coming together on, is that level of personalization where I get down to the VP of research. I can basically tailor a drip campaign or some sort of engagement process to that individual because of all this context. I can see what they've done in LinkedIn, whether I'm using Clay or other tools. I understand what's going on at the state level. I understand what's going on at the university level, and I understand what's going on in their town. Now, what can I do to do something like that? And then as soon as you give me any sort of indication of how you're engaging with it, now what's smart about the next one that I do, right? I'm not laying out this like drip campaign. It's dynamic based on what your actions are and how you reacted. Right. And like I was having this conversation before you and I got on with my founder. Like the technology stack to do that right now is not very good, right? I mean,
No.
we're basically using Supabase, we're using N8N. I'm basically building a bunch of things that are using Open Router. Like there's a bunch of technology, and so HubSpot and a lot of Marketo and Eloqua and all those other tools that are out there are a long way away from bringing that vision to life.
Yeah, this is a rapidly evolving world, and the players that are currently in that market space, I think are going to change at least a couple of times.
I agree. This is the
Yeah,
legacy, like you have to rethink it from first principles. And those guys have so much
right,
legacy that it's going to be hard to unravel that
right,
and redo this.
right. I completely agree. I completely agree. But you have to be on the journey. You have to be on the
Yeah.
path.
Yep.
Yeah, you have to be. And I think it's, if you look at, 2022 really marked a huge turning point in what AI systems had the ability to generate.
Yeah.
And I think we're starting to see now, more and more solutions come out of that. We're 2-3 years past that point now, and I think we're starting to see more solutions coming out. But I think it's going to be, we're going to see at least another evolutionary turn on tools and
Yep.
systems that are available. HubSpot, this is a point where HubSpot might not make it through this
Yeah. This
this
transition.
generational shift.
Yeah.
Yeah, they might not make it through that. Eloqua might not.
Yeah.
Salesforce, I have the sense that they probably will. But I think we might find something completely different coming out of this as they look at as you described, putting together all the pieces of a stack. It's classic at the early stage of an emerging market. You get lots of pieces and parts, and then as the market evolves, you get consolidation of that. And so it feels to me like in the next year, 2 years, we're going to see that, and it's going to be a huge opportunity for any company going to market. Any company going to market to change how they do that, to move more towards how do I really get close to my customer, and that again goes back to product market fit, right? How do I get really close to my customer with what they want to know at the time that they want to know it?
Yeah, and we've been talking about saying, how do we build kind of almost a startup operating system for founders, right? We're going to use
Oh
it for
yeah,
ourselves, right? Because we're
yeah,
saying what
yeah,
I just described for you is what we're going to go do. But abstracting that to all the founders that are in our program, they already know who their beachhead there are. They know what their value proposition. They have the ICP,
yeah.
so they have all the elements that they've done in our program. Why not put them on this? So we talked about the marketing piece to it. The sales one is kind of interesting to me, though. Is you generally have a lot of younger salespeople in these organizations that don't have a lot of discipline. But like if you just used a 3-stage demand funnel where you had education, discovery, and actual sales close process in it. And you basically were able to surface all this information when somebody got on the phone with them for prep, and then basically coach them saying, like, I got your read AI. I saw what their engagement looks like. You
Yeah,
spent
yeah,
way too much time talking about features and not drawing enough discovery questions out of them to understand kind of what problem they're really trying to solve and what they're doing today. That's like super good to like give them feedback all the way through to say, like, are you staying on message? Are you doing the right things? Can I give you better ideas of how to do that better next time? And I think the tools are here. Like, it's not that hard, and we're not that far away from it.
No, so it's interesting because I'm sure you're probably familiar with this Rackham in the spin selling model. The
Yep.
second body material they had was it's strategic. I think it called strategic account selling or strategic account management was the title of the book, and it's interesting because he lays out 5 stages of a customer's buying process.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I've been doing a lot of sales training in different companies, and one of the things that I do is they say, "Well, tell me how I need to sell." And I go, "Well, let me back up for a second. Let me tell you how customers buy,
Right.
and then we can align the efforts to
Yeah.
what the
Let's
customer is
start
trying
there.
to."
Let's start there.
Let's start there. And I found, what I found is I've trained sales organizations across manufacturing, distribution, services, technology, everything. I think it may be except retail. It's all been business to business. And what's really fascinating is there's been a transformational shift when we focus on in the organization and the success they're having. When we focused on how does your client buy? Let's just talk about the basic processes. So when you talk about taking that and instilling that in the organizations that you're working with, you're basically you're introducing scale at an earlier point, which is helping the organizations then scale up to get to their potential. And that's a powerful thing. The sooner the organizations get to a point where it's a consistent process, they've got their ICP, they've got their personas, they've got their value props, identified, and here's the process that your clients are going through, and now we can align to that. That process helps create scale so much earlier in the life cycle of an organization.
I agree. And I think the tools are just allowing us to do it so much better today. I mean, just what I've described, if you put that information in there, and we have all this data from 6 months of them going through our program. So it's super easy to actually say, now let's take this and put it into some structure that as you add people, there is consistency in the way they act. And there's coaching that comes back to them saying what you did well and what you could improve on next time.
Yep, exactly. And that then becomes, the flywheel.
It does come to the flywheel.
Yeah. No, that's cool. That's cool seeing you guys do that. That's I think that's really powerful.
Well, and I guess I'll use my own maybe mistakes and failures in the past. My first startup that I did, it was a trash can fire. It really was. I mean, I had a decent business plan. This is before the internet, so I mean, it was a while ago. But I didn't understand go to market. I had built a very good product, and it had, basically the state bought some of it. I was trying to get it into Walmart's and software, etc. It was a shrink wrap product, but I did not understand distribution. And essentially, over time, I had to let 14 people go. And, the first thing I ended up doing was I sold my car to make payroll. And so, that was enough to keep going for a while. And then all of a sudden I'm okay, well, I got to get out of my apartment and sleep on the couch and go at the YMCA and take a shower. And that was early in my career. That was the first startup I had done. And I was bound to determine after that, I'm not going to screw that up again. Right? Learning from your mistakes. This one was a hard one. And luckily that same group kind of stayed with us, and we sold 2 other companies after that, where I focused a lot more on go-to-market. But I think it was something that I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't put enough focus on early in their careers. They think if we build the product, it'll people will come, like Kevin Costner. And I think in today's day and world, it's just getting louder and louder. There's so much more noise. And so getting anybody to evaluate your value proposition or what problem you solve is becoming tougher.
I absolutely agree. Because of that, I love the idea that you described of customer funded development. Customers' money is the cheapest money you can get to fund a business.
It's not always easy.
It's not easy.
Yeah, but at the end of the day,
at the end of the day, you learn something. It forces you to get into the selling process. It forces you to understand the go to market, how they go about buying. Yeah, before you're invested in the 14 people that you've got to transition.
And it's non-dilutive, right? That's the other part that's great is you retain control and you're not giving up any equity in doing that.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's interesting. So my transition into sales was very deliberate and it was hard. But I would encourage any founder to spend any potential founder, any potential entrepreneur to spend as much time in sales as they can, just because of the exposure that it gives you to what's going to come. I was in a CIO role in an insurance company. I hated the CIO role, and I didn't enjoy working in an insurance company, right? So it didn't take much of a push, but I remember thinking, okay, if I'm going to get where I want to go, I got to go through sales. You can't get there unless you go through sales. So literally, I made the jump, and it was traumatic at the time. I was like, what am I doing? For all the reasons you can imagine, your income becomes variable. It's an entirely different skill set.
Pressure.
But when you think about it, that's what it means to be an entrepreneur, is to understand that. Yeah.
Well, and I would even maybe take it a step further. I think almost anything you do in life has some sales component of it, right? You're trying to convince somebody of something, right? And so the sooner you get that skill, I don't care if you're in marketing, I don't care if you're in engineering and you're trying to fight for a roadmap, discussion, or in product management, there's an element of sales in all of it. And the person that can communicate that value and get their point across and do it in a systems thinking model where you understand there's different perspectives, the more effective you're going to be, regardless, is my opinion.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, so we've covered hiring and the people component. That's huge. We've covered product management fit. We've covered the go-to-market side. I think the only place we haven't covered just briefly is the culture side.
Okay, good. Let's do that and finish up with that.
Yeah, we'll finish up with that. So it's interesting because there are, I think that let me back up. I've seen a lot of companies that have struggled with culture because it hasn't been a deliberate exercise.
Okay.
It's been something you say, well, this is what our culture is, but the reward systems and the behaviors that are exhibited in the organization aren't in line with what it is that they really believe their organization needs to be. So what I've found really powerful is for these entrepreneurs, before they engage in, if they were looking to hire us in to help them, or if they were looking to, on a consulting basis, or if they were looking to exit the business, one of the exercises we run through is, if you were to step back and define what you really wanted this business to behave like, what would that look like? And there are so many things that come out on a consistent basis. And it's not really about the things, it's about the alignment. Mm-hmm. And it's been critical for the long-term success of the projects or the businesses that we've been in, that definition has happened and it's been announced and it's taken place before we've gotten engaged. Okay. Because it creates that mental model with the people saying, oh, this is how this organization is going to make decisions, or is how it's going to value the work that we're doing. Yeah. And that's created, that dynamic has created sort of that moment of change that we needed to go in and create the other changes that were necessary. And any work that can be done to really flesh out what the true values are, and more often than not, they come down to the same principles. We want to do the right thing. We want to do the good thing. We want to take care of these people. We want to grow and build the people that are in this business. All the words are intermingled, but it comes down to the same things. But having that deliberate conversation for early stage companies to say, this is the value that we want to create, that we live by in this company, and then creating the reward systems that support that is critical to creating that moment of change that's needed before anybody comes in from the outside to say, we're going to help you here.
So have you found any sort of delta in aspirational goals versus reality? I think there's almost every founder is trying to say, I want to do the right things. But when it comes down to brass tacks, they don't live it. And so I think that's where I always have this challenge. And I have a company right now that I'm working with that basically has two cultural sets between the two founders. One runs engineering and the other one runs the rest of it. And there's higher accountability on one side than the other. And they basically have an agreed upon set of core values, or kind of what they're talking about from a cultural standpoint. But their interpretations and adherence to it are different. And it's creating a lot of problems as they scale.
That's amazing. Yeah, I see that quite a bit. It's interesting because I think what you described is, a common challenge with language, right? You pick a word, and what that word means to me might be something different than what it means for you. Yeah. I've done some work with organizations where we've gone in and we've spent months working on, what does this word mean? Let's describe this, and here's what it means. It's interesting because in some cases there's been a coming together, and in more cases there's been we're just not on the same page here, and they've had one founder leave or the other. But the process itself has driven that, which was going to be an eventuality anyway.
Yeah, right.
It was going to be an eventuality.
Manage it sooner than later. Yeah.
And we all agreed that it was better to do it sooner than later. And having the discussion actually, and this goes back to a body of work called Crucial Conversations, having those really tough conversations. And, having that goes back to that notion of, we want to get to someplace good, and we realize that we're not there right now. Let's just agree on that, and then take it from there. And it actually, more often than not, it leads to a good outcome, even if that means one person's got to leave the business or another.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in 2000, I think is when we did kind of core values. And actually, I sat on some leadership team to actually flesh those out across Concur. And at the time, I thought it was kind of early, and I had never been exposed to it, right? So I just, and so we went through it. But I do think it was one of those binding things that basically allowed us to scale. And I think it was less about like what you define, but then who are the stewards and the protectors of that, right? Like when you see good behavior, reward it. When you see bad behavior, have a conversation. And maybe the first conversation's behind closed doors, the second conversation is much more public, and the third one's probably out. And so adherence to it. And I think that was one of the number one things that when Concur got bought, like a lot of that that structure and adherence and reward of that culture started to fall apart very, very quickly. And because you had another culture that was coming in and they were telling you what to go do, and it was in conflict. And so now people are going, do I do that one which just acquired us, or what got us here? And I think it was a rapid change of what we valued and how we acted. And then there was really nobody to basically be the steward of saying, I'm going to protect this culture.
Yeah, that's got to come. That's got to come from the top down. There's no question about it. And protecting the culture, because people are going to watch what you do. They're going to watch what you say. They're going to watch how you behave, and they'll modify and adjust their behavior based on that.
Yep.
So you know, the steward of the culture, it has to come from the top down. It's not only the responsibility of the CEO, primary responsibility of the CEO, but also the leadership team. The leadership team's gotta live it, and they've got to demonstrate it. And I think that's, you know, if anything, what you're describing with Concur and SAP is classic.
Yeah,
I think it's classic. So, you know, now there's a lot to be said about whether M&A activity includes cultural diligence. Most of the time, it doesn't. You know, we're going to buy you. You're going to, you know,
adhere to our
you're going to be absorbed into the board,
That's
right?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. But what's more important is if you want to get to that point where Concur was in a position to be acquired by SAP for the value that was acquired by SAP, you got to have those hard conversations and you got to be living it. That's what creates a foundation in the background for the trust and for the ability of, you know, take it all the way back to the beginning of the conversation. You know, without that kind of cultural reinforcement, people won't trust. They won't step out to fail. They won't be accountable for their behavior.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Tim, you know, we've eaten up an hour. I feel like we just scratched the surface. I think the last conversation, I thought we could have talked for a while. This one, I think we have a lot of shared experiences. And I think I really appreciate you sharing kind of your wisdom, your frameworks, and just your experience, because I think that speaks volumes. People understand that you've been there, you've done that. And so thank you for taking the time.
Oh, love it. Appreciate it. Anything, as always, if there's anything that we can do to help, we're happy to help. This is our passion. This is what we enjoy doing.
So if people wanted to get and find out more about or work with you, what's the best way to go do that?
A couple of things. They can reach me through, you know, the website, GrowthFire, GrowthFire.com, or tbutler at growthfire.com.
Okay. Well, sounds good, Tim. Well, thank you again. I appreciate you taking the time.
Todd, as always, appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Startup Stories from the Treehouse. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like, follow, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you found our conversation helpful, leave a review. It really helps other founders discover our show. For more insight and episode summaries, don't forget to subscribe to the Wildfire Lab Substack. We appreciate your support and can't wait to share more stories with you next time.